Today is June 4th, and today I will be interviewing Vanessa Beeley, independent journalist who has spent many years in Syria, is now in Lebanon, about the current situation on the ground after Israel launched their unprovoked strikes against Iran, and Iran has retaliated. The situation has escalated. Let me just say, because the situation is moving so fast, that today is June 14th, and it is in the morning on the East Coast, in the afternoon in Lebanon, because things may move very quickly, and what we say may become outdated before too long. But Vanessa, let me bring you on. Hello and welcome.
Hi, Dan. It's good to be back on with you. I wish we were in slightly calmer situation, but it is what it is.
Me too, certainly. I actually, if you don't mind, wanted to share a short quote from John Quincy Adams, which I think is a bit frighteningly true. People quote the little section, but you'll hear his conclusion, which I think Americans should bear in mind very seriously. This is his July 4th, 1821 address. And he talked about how excited people were for the Declaration of Independence, how we had not been at war with any nation for 45 years, other than the British. He said, "She goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She well knows that by once enlisting under other banners than her own, were they even the banners of foreign independence, she would involve herself beyond the power of extrication in all the wars of interest and intrigue, of individual avarice, envy, and ambition, which assume the colors and usurp the standard of freedom. The fundamental maxims of her policy would insensibly change from liberty to force. The frontlet upon her brow would no longer beam with the ineffable splendor of freedom and independence, but in its stead would soon be substituted an imperial diadem, flashing in false and tarnished luster the murky radiance of dominion and power. She might become the dictatress of the world. She would no longer be the ruler of her own spirit." So I think incredibly prescient words for what happens if you run all over the planet you cannot forcing liberty on someone is a complete fallacy. It negates itself.
I would argue, what liberty? What liberty do Palestinians have, or Syrians, or Libyans, or Iraqis, or Yemenis? None. Absolutely zero liberty.
No, you don't think we're spreading democracy all over the world, don't you know? And we have it here, as I've experienced in my electoral campaigns.
Yeah, just like the missionaries before them. But yes. Destruction of indigenous cultures, civilization, and ancient histories and cultures that go way further back than American. You know, it's extraordinary, really, what is being destroyed, and it's world heritage. I don't even see it as isolated to one region or one country or one city or one town. It's our heritage as human beings, and that's what we should be focusing on.
Exactly. And therefore we are doomed to repeat the mistakes of history, since no one's going to know them. But maybe you should just catch us up a little bit. Last night on the symposium, I just went through a bunch of the statements that have come from the Russian Foreign Ministry and what Rubio had to say, and the really extremely unhelpful and bizarre posts that President Trump has been putting out on his social media.
Yeah.
And then after that, saying that he still thinks that Iran has a chance to negotiate, which I think is, I don't even know how you can think that. Who knows? Russia's going to play a big role, but perhaps you should go ahead, because you're on the ground and you'll have some sense of what people are saying, and don't be afraid to recap developments, because I think people need that too. So go right ahead.
Yeah, well, yesterday was certainly the beginning of the Israeli attacks were fairly horrifying. There had been clearly intelligence operations. I mean, of course, Israel is making the claims that they had embedded Mossad operatives. Actually, now I think they're saying Iranian Mossad operatives who carried out multiple operations to disable, at least temporarily, the air defense systems, but also to attack some of the missile launch systems within Iran itself. And of course, I think I'd have to take people back to, again, a very prescient document, not in a positive way, the document by the Brookings Institute, which I think was first penned in 2009 and then was added to in 2016. Now, in that document, and I think everyone will find this very interesting, and I'll try to condense it down to 4 sections. It's 170 pages. There are a number of articles that people can find on the web that have summarized pretty much what the document is saying if they don't want to trawl through 170 pages, which I am fully sympathetic with. So basically, they talk about, obviously, the path to Persia, an American strategy. And going further back to Wesley Clark, we know that the 7 countries that the US was intending to strike ended with Iran. So in the document, the Brookings Institute strategy paper, first of all, the first chapter is on the diplomatic options, which is, according to the document itself, a strategy to, first of all, engage, as for instance, with the nuclear agreement, which of course began under President Obama, and then Trump withdrew on the entire treaty. And that's actually written into the document. So they would begin negotiations, they would then withdraw, and then present Iran as being unreasonable, which of course is exactly what we've seen. Secondly, there is a chapter related to creating unrest within Iran, and of course from 2022, and even before that, but it sort of peaked at the beginning of 2022, we saw the effort to follow through on internal destabilization based on the spurious women's rights claims, which we'd seen previously, of course, in Afghanistan. Well, I would question exactly what rights women have in Afghanistan after 25 years of US influence there. And then the third chapter is basically related to the potential for a US invasion or an air attack on Iran. I think we can skip past that one to probably the longest chapter in the paper, which is using Israel to trigger a war against Iran. And initially, the US would kind of pretend to be backing off and not agreeing with Israel on the aggression against Iran. And that is exactly what we've been seeing. We've been seeing this theater of Trump pretending that he wants to continue negotiations, just as you just mentioned, Diane. The apparent rift between Netanyahu and Trump, which again I said at the time was just complete theater and that we should ignore it. The US is never going to abandon Israel, regardless of who's in charge there. And Netanyahu is the longest serving politician that has been at the reins or at the helm of the Zionist project. And so the US would appear to be reluctant. But of course, what we've seen is exactly that. Trump claiming plausible deniability, saying that they're publicly that they're not going to get involved. Whereas reports are now coming out that the US has been providing laser-guided missiles and other equipment. And there is no way that Israel could have conducted an operation of this magnitude without US allied support. And of course, we're now seeing that with Iran retaliating, that it's the US air defense systems, 4 layers of air defense systems, plus the allied countries, so Saudi Arabia and Jordan, intercepting or attempting to intercept Iranian missiles. So in a sense, I don't think anyone should be surprised, because this entire plan has been in the pipeline for what now, 15 years plus. And we knew that Iran was the final target once they destabilized the rest of the Middle East or West Asia. And if we go back, I think I mentioned this the last time we spoke, to an interview with Abu Mohammed al-Julani, who obviously is still al-Qaeda, but he's now been rebranded as Ahmed al-Sharaa, the new unelected president of New Syria, when he said in 2015 that their intention was to cut the hands of Iran, of the resistance. So, of course, that is effectively what has been happening with
on that. I just want to show
sorry.
a map. No, I just want to show this map that I found about the strikes, because then it hit me very hard also why they wanted Syria, which is, hold on here if I get it. I mean, clearly it doesn't work probably to go across Jordan and Iraq or through Saudi Arabia, which wouldn't support this. But isn't it convenient that if you fly over Syria to do these attacks, then you can get all the way there? I mean, you just, in a sense, see.
Well, yeah. I mean, this was when you say Saudi Arabia and Iraq wouldn't allow it. I mean, there have been videos of refueling of the Israeli jets over Iraq. And of course, we have to remember that Iraq is pretty much occupied by US bases. So again, when we hear that the US had nothing to do with it, they were fully cognizant of the attack months in advance. Now it's all coming out, of course. As I said, there were articles saying that Trump had been providing the laser-guided missiles. And I would argue that Trump was keeping the negotiations going for as long as possible. And you could see how much he was flip-flopping. 1 minute they would be allowed enrichment, the next minute they wouldn't. You know, typical Trump negotiations, flipping from one side to the other and keeping the negotiations dragging on. And of course, what does that allow? That allows the US time to supply Israel with the weaponry it needs and give Israel time to set up its intelligence operations inside Iran. So what Trump was doing, in my opinion, was playing for time.
Yes, exactly. And I think to give, I suspect the Iranians were not fooled, and how could anyone, frankly, trust the United States, but to create the appearance that, oh, yes, we're going to have negotiations on Sunday. And I want to add something else that I consider extremely important about this, because I think that the question of whether the United States and Russia can ever normalize relations is the major question for global security. And of course, what this puts on the table, and especially the nature of the way the attacks were done, is not only US knowledge of the attacks by Ukraine on Russia's military bases, but the direct US involvement. I know the Russians were very explicit to blame the British, and we know, in a sense, the British brains, American brawn, you know, in these things. But I do think this is going to be very, very tricky now for Russia, for President Putin, who's under extreme pressure from people who are much more hardline than he is, to not work with us. I mean, I think this just has all kinds of horrible destabilizing implications. But go ahead.
Just to come on to that quickly, and then I'd like to come back to the US role in the attacks on Iran and the general destabilization of the region. And exactly as Julani had said, to cut the hands of the resistance before finally, in his terminology, cutting the head of the resistance, which of course is Iran. So in a sense, that mirrors what Wesley Clark said, General Wesley Clark, when he said, apparently we're going to go after these 7 countries, ending with Iran. And of course, Trump was elected, in my opinion, to bring this to fruition, because I don't think Biden was effectively strong enough to do so. And this is what we've always seen. Trump has come in at critical stages when there's a need to both negotiate and to take aspects of the deep state and the Pentagon roadmap, which is generally on behalf of Israel, forward. And that is exactly actually what I was predicting when Trump hadn't even been elected. But I said he's going to be elected because this is the stage we're at. And this is the next stage. And he's the one they will bring in to push everything to termination, also including, of course, the awful final solution as they perceive it in Gaza and in Palestine as a whole, which of course actually is continuing without any deceleration while we're talking about Iran and Israel. Of course, what are they doing? Annexing further territory in the West Bank and continuing the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. And preventing the activists also from even leaving the airport at Egypt. But we can come back to that. And I'm sorry, I've digressed terribly from
no, that's fine.
Mr. Putin.
No, that's
my
fine.
brain just gets focused. No, so I think, the problem for Russia and for Putin, I mean, they left Syria, and I believe an aspect of them leaving Syria was the potential for a deal with the United States on Ukraine. They have then formed this strategic defense partnership with Iran. But what I find extremely interesting, if you look at the strategic partnership with North Korea, with the DPRK, there is actually a mutual defense pact within that agreement. So if North Korea is attacked, Russia will come to its aid. And if Russia is attacked, North Korea will come to their aid. There's no such deal with Iran. What Putin has written into that agreement is that there will be no mutual defense pact, but he will put himself forward to broker any kind of peace deal if there is an aggression against Iran. Now, my cynical head would say that Putin had a strong inkling that there would be an attack or an aggression by Israel at some point. I mean, to be honest, if you're on the ground, you would have seen it coming anyway. He didn't necessarily have to have an inside track, but I would guess he does. And as such, he made it very clear that he's not going to come up against Israel and by default the United States and the EU and the UK and the Gulf state allies of Israel against Iran. But what he is prepared to do is to broker a peace deal. So what he's effectively doing is stepping into that role, which had already been stated within that strategic agreement with Iran. So for me, I don't necessarily see anything particularly strange about what Putin is offering to do, because that had already been made public that would be his role under the UN Charter, et cetera, that he wouldn't get involved in any defense of Iran. And again, in my opinion, he would not get involved in anything that involved a war against Israel, because actually the Russian-Israeli alliance is very strong. So I think you're right. If there is to be stability between Russia and the United States, Russia is walking a very fine tightrope. But I think having already made it very clear to Iran, and I can speak from an understanding here in the region. I mean, Syed Hassan Nasrallah, before he was assassinated, he spoke very clearly about Russia. He said, look, Russia is not an ideological ally and we should never count on them. However, they have provided support and assistance as they did in Syria. So there's a respect for Russia, but there's not an expectation of Russia in the region and among the resistance. Syria, in my opinion, made a big mistake in relying too much on Russia and believing that there was a historical ideological alliance there that really wasn't there. Russia came in for its own interests. Yes, it supported Syria. Yes, it was very helpful to Syria, particularly, when it came in September 2015 and through 2016, when it did push back the ISIS forces considerably and dramatically. But there was never the ideological alliance that I think the Syrian leadership believed that they had. And unfortunately, for me, that was one of the reasons for the downfall of Syria, because there was too much trust and belief that Russia would have their back, basically.
That's interesting. Now, please go on. You can follow any of the threads that you just started. Everyone watching will be interested.
Well, I think for me, one of the most important threads is, yes, we were all holding our breath in horror when we were seeing the targeting, particularly the assassination of a huge number, really, of both the military high command in Iran, but also I think now 9 nuclear scientists have been reported to have been assassinated in the initial Israeli attacks. And this is what brings me back to the Brookings document, where they're talking about regime change in Iran being one of the preferred options. And of course, what are they doing? Exactly what they did in Lebanon, which is to pick off the high-ranking members of the Iranian military leadership, those that are close to the Ayatollah Khamenei and the supreme leadership, picking off the experts in their field. And that's another thing also that they've been doing on a regular basis in Gaza, for example. They're killing the academics, the medics, the journalists, the scientists, anyone with the education and the ability to actually change the course of history is being eradicated. The same actually in Syria. So wherever they're operating, that is their modus operandi. And so I think what we were watching was the beginning of this, using Israel as a battering ram, but also really pushing forward with regime change by removing those very influential figures in Iran. And actually, just a quick thought that always comes to me when I talk about this is that this is exactly what they did in 1948 during the Nakba, when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were ethnically cleansed. They were trained by a British general, Lord Wingate, who trained the various Zionist forces to identify the community leaders in every village, town, region, province, and basically pick them off so that the people would be left without leadership and without guidance. And so this, for me, is actually, it's a very British tactic, which the Zionists have continued with throughout their existence, throughout the existence of the so-called state of Israel. So that for me is quite interesting, that this tactic is, this strategy is still being used today. And of course, going back to the fact that it was President Trump that, if you like, he didn't begin it, but he began this stage of this tactic by the assassination of Qasem Soleimani.
Right.
And then, of course, we had the mysterious death. I still do think it was an assassination of President Raisi and Abdul Hayyan, the foreign minister. And of course, President Raisi was very much seen as the successor to the Ayatollah Khamenei, who was killed in that tragic helicopter crash last year. And then, of course, the various assassinations here in Lebanon of the leadership, in Palestine, and so on. But I think also on the flip side, what I'm looking at is that Trump had to withdraw from the aggression against Yemen, because effectively the Pentagon said to him, "No, like, can you back off? Because you've already lost over 1 billion. You know, what was it? The Hornet, the AWAC planes that just sort of fell overboard. You know, yes. 22 drones." And so I think he had his knuckles wrapped, and he was told to get out, because you're throwing military equipment away, you're throwing money down the drain. And now, of course, we have Iran that has, according to some reports, downed now 3 F-35 stealth bombers that are around 110 million each, right? But it's not only the financial impact of the equipment itself being destroyed, it's the PR impact against the US supremacist kind of image that they've been promoting for all of these decades. When you have a situation now that, as I said, the 4 layers of air defense provided very much by the United States is simply not working sufficiently to prevent, I think it was around 100 missiles that Iran sent last night. Today, they're talking about sending 2,000. And with the 100 that they sent, the damage was already extensive across Tel Aviv, right? Mm-hmm. And so what's happening is, Yeah,
Could you
sorry.
say something about that, the damage across Tel Aviv, because they're trying so very hard to keep it from the press. And I just want to say another aside here, because in 1980, and well, really the late 70s, early 80s, Lyndon LaRouche was proposing a strategic defense initiative, which was laser technology to shoot down nuclear missiles. But he knew that the science didn't exist, and he wanted it as a joint endeavor between the US and the Soviet Union as a science driver to also make nuclear missiles obsolete. And then you had all these crazy people pushing things like smart pebbles and all this nonsense that you can create a, quote, iron dome, which frankly will not work. And especially, I would say, because the US is in such a cultural and educational dark age, the Russians, the Chinese, many people on the planet are surpassing us by leaps and bounds with the technology they have, like the Orezhnik and the hypersonic missiles. So I just want to say it shouldn't be surprising to people that this great iron dome is not so effective. But please tell us what's happened in Tel Aviv.
Well, there have been a huge number of injuries. Of course, Israel will be downplaying the civilian cost. But I would also argue, of course, that when Israel talks about Hamas using civilian and residential areas to fire their rockets from, the largest of the military bases and centers is in the middle of Tel Aviv, nestled in among residential areas and shopping centers and so on. So I think really we should stop this hypocrisy, particularly after Israel targeted residential areas in Tehran, killing, I think it's 78 civilians, including, of course, women and children. And for Israel, that will be perceived as collateral damage, as it always is. But the damage, from what I've seen, is pretty extensive across Tel Aviv, or occupied Yaffo, as it should be known, I guess. That was the original name. But I think it was the Ministry of Defense, so the Kiryat, I've maybe pronounced that wrong, center that was targeted directly and has received extensive damage, but also a number of the air bases I saw before I came on, including the Nevatim base, have been targeted and hit directly, causing extensive damage, according to foreign media. And of course, I'd like to go back to this on True Promise 2, where to a degree I spoke to someone inside Iran who spoke very frankly about the shortfall on the Iranian side, in the sense that they had targeted specific areas and the accuracy of the missiles was not great. What appears to have happened this time is that Iran has been working on this aspect of their missile system, and that this time the missiles hit target. So I think that's quite an important point to make, because Iran, how I perceive it is that Israel runs a war of intelligence and subterfuge and blitzkrieg. And to do that, it relies upon the US to provide the missiles to run these kind of shock and awe campaigns. The opposite is what Iran does. Iran and the resistance factions in the region run a war of attrition. In other words, they prepare themselves, rather like Russia and Ukraine, to run these wars for extended periods of time, and to be able to absorb the hits while keeping this war of attrition against Israel, both from an economic perspective, which we can see with what Yemen is doing, but also from the perspective that Iran, according to what it is saying, it has the missile capacity to keep this war going for a very long time. Now, Israel doesn't. It's entirely dependent upon the US to keep this war running. And I think that's a very important point. For how long is the US going to be supplying the missiles to allow this war to continue, or to potentially escalate to a nuclear level? And with saying that, I'm not saying that Iran has nuclear weapons. I don't believe it has, because the supreme leadership issued a fatwa a long time ago against the manufacture of nuclear weapons. But of course, they've been defending their right to have a missile program, an ordinary ballistic hypersonic missile program, and to basically enrich the uranium. That was their red line in the negotiations. But what people often forget is that Israel not only has a very secret nuclear program that is outside of the non-proliferation treaty, but it also has what is known as the Samson Doctrine, which was established under Ariel Sharon, which effectively says that if Israel considers that it is facing an existential threat, it will use nuclear weapons against even an ally state. That's a very important point to make. So there's no differentiation between an enemy state and a friendly state if at any time there is a situation in which Israel feels it should use nuclear to prevent the destruction of Israel itself.
That's particularly alarming given how criminally minded and unstable Netanyahu is. I mean, this is not exactly, and I'm saying that from the United States, but at any rate, this is not a rational regime that's in place there.
No, it isn't. But I would caution against sort of making Netanyahu the scapegoat. Mm-hmm. Because if you were to remove Netanyahu tomorrow, there would perhaps be even more extremist, far right Zionists who would take his place, like Bezalel Smotrich, like Ben Gvir, both of whom have been reestablishing the Ergen and Stern terrorist gangs within Israel itself, arming the extremist and fanatic settlers and so on.
But there isn't, say something please about the opposition in Israel, because it seems, I have a sense that this is growing. I mean, like Ukraine, when you're under a kind of dictatorship with these kind of extremists with massive prison and torture capabilities, many people would tend to be silent. But it seems to me that there is a growing resistance for different reasons. The criminality of Netanyahu, they're not getting the hostages back if they keep slaughtering people. What's your sense of what's happening in Israel?
Well, I think it was Alistair Crook, who's former MI6 and who worked inside Israel itself for a long period of time. I think he made it very clear, look, 90% of the population agree with the extermination of Palestine and of Palestinians. The internal disagreements, let's say, do exist, but those people are only interested in, as you said, releasing the hostages or preventing their community being conscripted into the army. These uprisings have nothing to do with the greater geopolitical concerns in occupied Palestine. And so I think, yes, there is potential. Of course, there's potential for a huge divide in Israel, even between, as I said, the Knesset and Netanyahu and those far-right extremists that I was talking about. And now that's the majority of the settlers inside Israel that are being given weapons by Ben Gvir and by Smotrich. And there is potential for an uprising of those extremist factions against what might be considered a more moderate Netanyahu. I mean, that's the kind of crazy situation that we're in right now. There's extremists fighting extremists, which again, of course, is a familiar plan for the British, because of course that's what you've seen. Particularly in Syria now, there are extremists fighting extremists. There are former militia of Jolani heading off to join ISIS because ISIS uphold their fanatic Takfiri ideology better than Jolani. And I'd like to make the point that Jolani must be shaking in his boots right now, because with this escalation, who does he stand alongside? Because he's basically, sorry to use this terminology, but he's prostituted himself out to almost every regional power, from Turkey to Israel to the British to the French. to the United States, to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, to UAE. So who exactly is he going to either, one, expect to come to his aid if the entire regional war escalates? Where is Syria going to stand in this? That's a very important question. And if it does come to a regional war, of which there is high potential, will the Syrians within Syria turn against Jordan? You see what I mean? So the Syria right now is facing yet again an existential crisis, having already gone through one for the last 14, 15 years.
It's a bit like Stepan Bandera, who was really happy to side with Hitler when he thought he was winning, and then changed his position when Hitler wasn't winning anymore. No, that's really... and Netanyahu, of course, is doing this with this Shabab character now, right? I mean, after years of funding and creating Hamas because he wanted to make sure Palestine couldn't be unified, now he's funding extremist, insurgent, anti-Hamas something. Do you have more on that?
Yes. I mean, basically, this shouldn't be any surprise. I'd need to go back over my archived notes, but I remember in 2014, after the Zionist aggression back then, that there were, again, British lawyers working inside Gaza to determine, as they said, the perpetrators of the war crimes. Now, I happen to know the translator who was working alongside them. And they told me, Vanessa, I don't understand this. Why do they keep asking me whether it was Israel or ISIS that committed these crimes? And I was also sort of slightly scratching my head at the time, being, following the Syria crisis closely. So in my opinion, these ISIS characters were being both created and radicalized within Gaza for this purpose. And yes, you mentioned that Israel weaponized Hamas to a degree to weaken the PFLP and Fatah and the other factions. And there was a degree of collaboration between Israel and the former Hamas leadership, including Khalid Mashal, who also betrayed Syria and worked with Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood factions inside Syria against the Syrian government. But from 2017 onwards, there were huge changes made in Hamas itself, both within the leadership, bringing in Yahya Sinwar and a number of other much more resistance-focused leadership. And so it pivoted to a large degree back towards the resistance of access from particularly 2021 onwards, when they came to Damascus for a meeting with President Assad. And the brigades that you have now, the military factions, the Qassam brigades, are completely aligned with the resistance of access. They are clearly not aligned with Israel in any way, shape at all. And that, of course, is why Netanyahu now has stepped in to basically arm what he calls the clans, but he knows full well that these so-called clans are aligned with ISIS ideology, the more fanatical Takfiri ideology. And so, of course, now he's doing what he always does and what the British always do, which is to align or to arm these factions to turn against the factions that have turned against him, if that makes sense. Right?
Yes.
And this is what he's always done. It's what Israel has always done. They were arming and providing free healthcare, by the way, for the Takfiri factions in Syria, including ISIS. I mean, I remember in 2018 when they evacuated them all, and they claimed they were only evacuating the CIA and MI6 white helmets. In fact, they took a number of ISIS and extremist leaders out of southern Syria when southern Syria came back under the protection and control of the Syrian government and the Russians. And I remember going to Quneitra on the border with Israel and seeing the hastily erected hospital that they'd hastily torn back down. And around this entire building site was Israeli medicine strewn on the ground. I mean, I've got photographs and video of this, and it was literally a meter away from the border fence, the illegal border fence that the Israelis had erected between Syrian Golan and the occupied Syrian Golan, occupied by the Zionists, of course.
Wow.
So,
Now,
this is nothing new for Netanyahu. This was a very familiar tactic.
well, it's a very typical divide and conquer. I mean, that's an old, and it is astounding, all these factions, why I think you have to have a broader mission. But I'm going to push back a little bit on this 90% in Israel support the policy of ethnic cleansing or taking over. I just find that really difficult to believe. One, because it goes so much against human nature, and two, because you do see this group of a few thousand, whatever it was. You can say it's a minuscule percentage of Israeli Arabs and Jews marching to the border and so on. And I think that if the support really were that great, they wouldn't even be alive. There has to be some conscience. Maybe it's not a majority, but there has to be some conscience under this. And I can say here in the U.S., the New York, New Jersey area, as you might imagine, it's coming back. For example, my husband had a conversation with somebody who has family members who are in the IDF. And this person who had really disagreed with our assessment of what was happening between Israel, Gaza, October 7th, etc. He was very pro-Israel, pro the genocide, although he wouldn't call it that, of course. But then he did admit that his nephew had come back from over there and had said, what we're doing is really not right. We're just breaking down people's doors. We are making everybody hate us. And therefore, I think, the truth of the ugliness, the evil, it goes so against human nature that anyone with a conscience is going to be horrified by it. And those, of course, are the ones who get PTSD or who commit suicide, like we're seeing in the United States. We have four times more now, or maybe higher, soldiers who've died by suicide than died in combat. And the way Colonel Wilkerson described it, which is so deadly as these wars drag on, is that the people with conscience end up out because of PTSD or brain injuries that they actually identify. And then the ones that are left are the really hard stone killer people prepared to commit the most unthinkable atrocities for anyone else once your military goes through some months or years of this kind of meat grinder. So I don't know what you think about that, but I find it hard to imagine that 90% of the population actually supports this. When you have people who are evil, like toxic personalities, they become the dominant feature because people who wants to run around being nasty and evil all the time? So the people who aren't that way tend to withdraw. They are silent. You don't know that they're there. And therefore in the Ukrainian Maidan, the C-14 white supremacist group bragged, they said we were 8%. And I think that might be true, 8% pro-neo-Nazi fascist, but they become the dominant feature because they are so aggressive, so terrifying, and so vicious to anyone who stands in their way.
I think there's a big difference living in the region here and living in America and looking at what Israel is doing with huge respect. Because I will just give a very small example. We were having dinner the other night with some friends who live in the southern suburbs of Beirut. And in the midst of dinner, Israel issued an evacuation warning of 4 buildings that were around their home and next to a school. This is at night. And even though the Lebanese army said, well, hold on, we'll go and check the buildings for what you're claiming, and we'll inform you that there are no fighters there, there's no weapons. Even if there were, it's none of Israel's business, to be honest. The agreement focuses on southern Lebanon, not on southern Beirut, but anyway. And so she had basically 20 minutes to send an Uber to pick up her 3 kids and her sister from the house and bring them to safety before the bombs hit. And they can hit at any time. It's not me that's saying it's 90% of the population. It's the majority of polls. No, but it's the majority of polls and expert opinion. Alistair Crook is someone who's lived and worked in Israel and has a degree of sympathy for Israelis and for those conservative Israelis that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But whether those Israelis agree with the methods that are being employed by the Israeli forces or not, I would almost guarantee that they still agree with the fact that this is Israeli homeland and that the Palestinians can live in apartheid camps, but they can't actually be integrated in society or have their own state. That's a tiny minority. And if you watch a documentary called Israelism, and I recommend everybody watches it, you can see the degree to which children from kindergarten upwards, not only in Israel, but across the world, really, but particularly in the US, the UK, and the EU, are brought up to hate. They're brought up in an environment of hatred from the age of 2 or 3 upwards. Mm-hmm. And then you have the system of the birthright visits to Israel for Israelis or for Jews living in the States or in UK or US, right? And so there's an entire propaganda machine working to sustain the hatred of the Palestinians, and it's very successful. And yes, I'm sure there's a very small minority. There are some very good activists in Israel that do push back against what is happening. There are some good organizations like B'Tselem, like Breaking Silence, those former IDF soldiers who've come forward to speak about the atrocities. But I struggle to have any sympathy for an Israeli soldier that's now suffering PTSD after what they did in Gaza. I can't. My sympathy lies with the Palestinian children that are being burned alive or being raped or imprisoned, tortured. I mean, the list is endless. Who's going to take care of their PTSD? Who's going to take care of their trauma of potentially having lost their entire family or seeing their brother executed on the street in front of them while he's trying to save someone else, or he's trying to go and get a sliver of bread or food for his family? I can't, and until Israelis as a whole rise up against this, then their humanity is going to be questioned, and it should be questioned by any thinking human being, because we cannot continue to watch what is unfolding on an hourly, minute-by-minute basis in Gaza and the West Bank since October the 7th, but has been happening for the last 100 years. And now, keep turning away and waiting for, a good person in Israel to stop it. That isn't going to happen. It rests upon us to stop it, and it rests upon the resistance fighting here in this region to prevent it and to stop it and to prevent it happening ever again.
Well, 2 things, and whatever, one of them slipped out of my mind, but it'll come back. I think that you're right. The resistance and opposition is certainly growing in the United States. And I've been happy with a number of the posts of Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's this ardent Trump supporter, but then explains why she did not vote in favor of the last hate crimes legislation. She said, she said, do you realize this is the 20th and 21st hate crimes legislation about anti-Semitism, but there are many, many other people who are dying and we never hear anything about any of them. And she said, frankly, I think if you're just loyal to one other nation or one group of people, you're sowing division and creating anti-Semitism. She had the courage to say that. And so people were posting underneath, did she also add a note that she's not planning to commit suicide? Because then, it's, and also Yeah, very outspoken against the Iran war, as has been Tucker Carlson. Tulsi Gabbard, as you're seeing, is getting absolutely roasted by deranged people because she put out this video about Hiroshima and nuclear war. And they're saying, oh, isn't she just like Obama, apologizing? And of course, the lie is we didn't need to drop the nuclear bombs. That was deliberately done to create the conditions, in effect, to oppose a one world dictatorship through fear. But I think they're in trouble. You don't have to shut down university protests and deport people for writing op-eds about genocide if the majority of people are with you. So the revolt and revulsion against this really is growing. And I think there's a time limit, in a sense, to carry out this agenda. But anyway, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I agree. And I remember the dear departed Francis Boyle, human rights lawyer, who's someone, I never met him, but I always conversed with him by email on a regular basis. And he told me, because I actually sent him the documentary Israelism, he said, Vanessa, this is already happening. There's a pushback, particularly by younger generation Zionists against the Zionist ideology. So I do agree with you. I do think there is a huge pushback globally because of what we've seen, and it would be inhumane of us to turn away from what we're witnessing in Gaza or in the West Bank, although that's receiving sort of far less attention than Gaza. And I think that is, you're absolutely correct, that is where, to a degree, in the West, the hope lies. For us here, and I do speak like that because I've been living here for a long time now. For us here, the hope is in the resistance. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? We're not waiting for the UN to do anything. We're not waiting for the ICJ to do anything, or the ICC, or for condemnations in XYZ to do anything, because it doesn't. Israel is acting with impunity. So here in the region, for people to understand, the people rely upon the resistance. And that's it. Nobody pays really much attention to what the West is saying. About what's going on.
If your house is about to be bulldozed over, and I don't think you're going to wait to see what happens in the U.S. Congress. I understand.
No, but so I think to some degree that there's two levels of resistance going on here, and what is happening in the U.S. and in the U.K. and in the EU is very important. I mean, in the U.K., sorry. We've got Palestine Action that are taking direct action against the weapons manufacturers. And I mean, they are being severely punished for it. But as you said, why do they need to be so severely punished? Right? If you're in a powerful position, you can afford to be lenient, right? But if you are in a weakened position, because your image is suffering. I mean, for example, very recently, there was a report about the British training Israeli forces in the UK. And that's been picked up by almost every single media. There's been a mutiny by the civil servants, 300 civil servants against the Foreign Office over their policy on Gaza, and complaining that in staff sessions, they're not even allowed to talk about Gaza. It's completely, it's absolutely stopped before it can start. And we had the same situation in the BBC with journalists anonymously complaining that they were being forced to follow a certain line on Israel. And I think, this wave of dissent and mutiny is definitely growing in the West. And it's a very important one because ultimately, in my opinion, the US, the UK, and the EU are in danger of being completely captured by this movement, by the Zionist movement. It's funding the majority of the presidential candidates. It doesn't matter whether it's Democrat or Republican, to be honest, and the same in the UK. So I think it's an important battle in the West, but I think the two battles, we talked about this last time, should be seen not as separate, but running in parallel.
Mm-hmm. Now, just two things. One, for you to know, we have had our younger organizers out on the streets of Manhattan, not too far from Columbia University. And what they're picking up is a deep reservoir of support and respect from the people who live in the Upper West Side, which is a very large Jewish American neighborhood. I did petitioning in that neighborhood to get on the ballot, and this was now a year ago. And at that time, people were telling me their synagogues were completely split 50-50 on the ceasefire question. I would say that support for the resistance against the genocide is only growing. And that's interesting to me, because you wouldn't have that sense if you just hear the coverage of Columbia, that what's happened is the courage of the students.
Yeah.
And the teachers who are standing up for them is actually having a radiating effect on all of Upper Manhattan. So they can't stop this. The other thing and we don't have much time, and maybe we have to do a whole other program, but I know there are a lot of people questioning, finally, how October 7th was allowed to happen. And I wanted to get your sense, if there's any shift going on, or that people have been suspicious of that, as many of us were about 9/11, which was certainly used for a whole range of horrific policies. What's your sense of what happened that day, or not what happened, but what people think about it, what they're saying about it, what's coming to light?
I think how I would address it, because I was thinking about this with Iran now retaliating and there being potential for civilian casualties, and the fact that the resistance really historically has avoided civilian casualties. It's tried to limit its targeting to military only, right? People may not be aware of that, but it's an ideology within the resistance, and particularly in Iran. And that I saw changed yesterday, because at the end of the day, Israel targeted civilian areas. And so therefore, from an Iranian perspective, that means, okay, the gloves are off, because you've now targeted our civilians. We can't now hold back. There has to be a deterrence reimposed. And so I think my point would be that what happened on October the 7th, in my opinion, whether it was known of in advance or when it happened, the leadership in Israel decided, great, now we have a chance to actually finish the job and really finish the genocide. If we can use this as a propaganda tool, we can finish what we want to finish and arrive at the final solution. And particularly with Trump coming in, they knew that the opportunity would be there. And when you talk about the Hannibal Doctrine and the fact that now it is coming out, it's public knowledge now that the Israelis bombed and shot at by helicopter their own civilians. They didn't allow them to live, and the majority were killed by the Israelis themselves. I think this is a very important point for people to understand. And the fact that Netanyahu has not retrieved the hostages, Israel has broken the ceasefire agreement on multiple times, on multiple occasions. When Hamas has agreed something, Israel will then add a new clause. And that's exactly what they did also with the Lebanese situation. It's what they do. And it's what we've seen happening also with Iran and Trump, right?
Right.
So they're doomed to failure because they want them to fail. That's effectively what we need to understand. But we also need to understand that ordinary Israelis are of no consequence to the ruling elite.
Right.
And to those that have the bigger agenda. The Israelis don't count. The Palestinians don't count. Ordinary Israeli civilians are not important. That's been proven. And that's something that really should be in the minds of even people who support Israel. That ultimately you don't count. You're an instrument. You're a tool, just as all of us are, for the ruling elite, bipartisan ruling elite. And those that are actually running the agenda right now. And so I think ultimately we have to consider who values human life and who doesn't. And we should be supporting those that do value human life and challenging those that don't, because that's the bottom line. Whether you're, Israeli, Palestinian, Iranian, Ukrainian, Russian, that's what we should be looking at more closely. And for me, it's a rule of thumb when I look at something. Who is trying to preserve human life and who doesn't care?
Yes. Well, I think that's right. And I agree wholeheartedly. And I think that's a good place to conclude this discussion. And as our mutual friend suggested, perhaps we should do this more often. I got a lot of very positive response from our last interview. People, you're obviously, you know what you're talking about, and you're not owned by someone of these entities. And you're optimistic. Which is really critical, because we have to get mankind. I don't want to see all of civilization annihilated. I don't want every last person to end up dead in a nuclear war. I want mankind to grow up and to look back on. I keep thinking of how naive I was as a child when I heard things about Nazi Germany or the Dark Ages, and I used to think to myself, I'm so glad that we don't act like that anymore. And then you discover, oh dear, we have not outgrown this juvenile barbaric behavior to move on to those things that are really human, which is the play of the mind, scientific discoveries, classical music, poetry, the things that actually really make people very happy and eliminate the need for conflict. So we have to fight to get there. And I want to thank you for your work in that regard. And I can assure you we are working over here in that regard very hard to build the American opposition to this insanity, and also inform people of pathways to a solution, because peace is not merely the absence of conflict. There has to be a forward path for mankind to develop.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, Diane.
You're welcome.